Today we want to talk a little bit about factors in human development, and we want to break that down into a couple of categories. We want to talk about biological factors, and social factors. And then underneath that we want to talk about various categories that are either biological or social, or in some cases both, as factors in human development. So the first one we want to talk about is parents. When we think in terms of parents, it is both a biological and a social factor in the development of a person. Parents influence biologically, obviously, because they're the parents, passing on traits, personality traits, physical traits, these sorts of things. But they also influence socially based on their type of parenting, whether it's authoritarian or permissive. The fact that the children, especially at a young age, spend a great deal of time with the parents. They pass on ideas to them, patterns of behavior, habits, values, these sorts of things. So parents, as a factor in development, pass on both biological and social influences in that development. Second, we want to talk about peers. Here, obviously, there's no biological influence, but there is a very strong social influence as a person develops, beginning in young childhood and the time when they start getting socialized and spending time with others their age. Peer pressure starts to build in, especially during adolescence and teen years, and becomes a very strong social factor in a person's development, controlling or at least strongly influencing the way someone thinks, feels, acts, as they want to conform to that particular group or be opposed perhaps to another group of which they have an aversion to. So their peers, those around them, for good or for ill, have a very strong influence in terms of a factor of development. Next, we want to talk about society. Here, once again, no biological factor in development, but once a very strong factor in development. Those societal groups, community groups, those around an individual, not necessarily peers, they could be of any age group, socioeconomic status, whoever it is that is around them, can have a very strong social impact on their development. Here we might think in terms of churches, community groups, neighbors, schools. They pass on ideas, standards, values, beliefs, and other influences on behavior. And sometimes those influences are for good, sometimes they're for ill. We might think of perhaps a negative influence of society being gangs, and perhaps a positive influence in society being local neighborhood groups, family groups of which they're a part, churches, religious groups, these sorts of things. But they tend to be a very strong factor in development. Next, we want to talk about media. Here again, no biological factor, but an extraordinarily strong social factor. Things like radio, TV, the internet, ways of accessing information, perhaps different from their particular worldview or ideas, have a strong impact on them, especially when you link the visual with the auditory. So TV, films, these sorts of things become very strong avenues for social development, perhaps exposing the person to new ideas that are either reinforcing of their current ideas or challenging to them, stretching them, broadening them in various ways, or even changing them altogether. So there's a very strong influence in this regard as they are able to see and hear perhaps different lifestyles, different presentations of behavior, these sorts of things. So media is a strong factor in development. And then the last thing we'll talk about is gender identity. And under gender identity, we have both a biological factor and a social factor. Ordinarily, or more often than not, at least at this point, someone's perceived gender corresponds to their biological gender, and that's why we say there is a biological factor in terms of development of gender identity. But it's not the only thing that influences that, and there are cases where someone's biological gender is one thing, and yet their perceived gender identity is another, and this is sometimes influenced by their various means here within society. Their parents, their peers, society, or media can have an impact on that. And there are some discussions right now within the scientific community and whether or not there's a biological factor in that as well. A person's gender identity begins to develop in infancy, and carries forward from there, and either it is reinforced biologically and socially, or changed or challenged, if you will, biologically or socially. So all these are factors in development: the parents, the peers, the society, the media, and their gender identity. All of them are social. Some of them have biological factors involved in them as well. If you'd like to study more about this, learn a little bit more, I encourage you to go to the link below this video to that website to study this further, and there is available at that website an ebook for immediate download.